Welcome. I guess we just start.
I think
you want to introduce yourself?
Yep. Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Kris Kubiena from VocaLink. I look after our international business development, and I'm delighted to be here. And I have to say, I've really enjoyed the past sessions, and I've learned something. So hopefully, between Steve and I, we'll pass on some of our experiences to you in this session. We've decided that rather than do just a set of dry slides and walk through them, it's much better to do this interactively. So at any point when you think we're talking nonsense, please shout. If you'd like to know more, please just ask questions and we'll respond. And I guess before I start, the other thing I've just realized is that I've been set up here because I'm going to talk about UK faster payments, which is a service and a program of work that we're very proud of, that was delivered in 2008. And then Steve is going to talk about instant payments in the US, which is a program that's being delivered in 2016. So I think I know who's going to come out of that looking good. So maybe this will be more about lessons learned, what went well, what didn't go so well. And I'll also talk about some of the other initiatives going on globally, because this continues to be the hot topic. Everybody who does instant payments moves the paradigm forward to some degree or another. So UK did it in a certain way. Singapore went live in 2014, and they certainly moved it forward in terms of the capabilities, in terms of how it works. Thailand implementing a program this year, and they're certainly moving it forward. And we're very proud to be working with Steve because the US is definitely moving it forward, and hopefully Steve will share some of that with you.
All right. And I'll introduce myself, Steve Ledford with the Clearinghouse, heading up our real-time payments initiative. And I feel like maybe I've been set up a little bit because we're talking about lessons learned, but we're just starting, and Kris and company have been doing it for quite a while now. And I also noticed he said, if you feel we're talking nonsense, shout. I have a feeling he's actually talking about what he's done. So wait till I at least get through my first slide before you shout nonsense, okay? Great. Well, you ready to get going?
Yes, absolutely. Regulation. So the UK faster payments was born out of regulatory pressure. And VocaLink, I have to say, loves the regulator because in many cases they do create change, they do support innovation, but not always in a way that achieves the end results. So, or the end results that they're expecting. In the UK, the regulator decided that taking 3 days to move money from one bank account to another bank account and have the money disappear somewhere on the second day probably wasn't the best in terms of the consumer experience. And to be fair, the banks accepted that something needed to be done, and rather than go from 3-day cycle to a 1-day cycle, they made, I think, what was quite a brave decision at the time to go to real-time or instant payments and have the money move immediately. But one of the lessons learned from that is that regulatory pressure will not always achieve the objectives that you expect. To deliver a service that delights the consumer, but also delivers the benefits that the participants expect, you have to have a combination of meeting the regulatory requirements, but also creating a platform that allows participants, and I have a tendency to say banks, but that's not the case anymore. It's not just banks who are the participants. It's a number of different entities. It could be any of the fintech companies, it could be other payments processors, so it's not just about banks. But you have to create something that allows them to innovate, that allows them to deliver services that generate revenue as well as delight the customer. And that certainly wasn't the case for every single participant in the UK. Many treated it as a compliance project, and we all know getting the budget for a compliance project is relatively easy, so it's a compliance project, it's got to be funded. But the interesting lesson that we learned in the UK was that those banks or those participants who decided to take the opportunity to renew their technology, to create new payments capabilities, those are the banks who are reaping the benefits now, and those are the banks who are delighting their customers and generating revenue for themselves. And it took a long time to actually innovate in the UK. Payments volume growth was very fast. We moved standing orders to the faster payment service. So standing orders were processed in real time. So the volumes grew because it became a trusted, proven method, a simple method of processing payments. But it took quite a while for innovation to happen, for true innovation that had an impact on the consumer. So to start off with, faster payments was used as a service for person-to-person transactions. People could move money in real time. They could pay their son or daughter who was at university in real time, and they could go and withdraw the cash. So quite a good consumer experience, but not in any way earth-shattering, I think would be fair to say. Person to business, a growing area of the service, and perhaps a little bit more interesting, particularly when it comes to the SME space. So if you think about the electrician, the plumber, who needs to be paid in real time to do that. They maybe have to go and buy parts. They're fixing your air conditioning or your central heating or whatever it may be. They need to be paid in real time. They need that cash. Traditionally paid by check, not the best method, or paid by cash. And it's funny to say that some plumbers actually do need to be paid electronically because they've got to show something going through the books. So there are moments when actually they do want a payment that is not just a cash payment. So the ability to do that in real time is quite an effective use case. Business to business, so another growing area in terms of faster payments, having a big impact in reducing costs for corporates and for banks. Clearer view of cash flow, easier to trace payments. Creditors are paid in real time. You don't have to set the payments up 3 days beforehand. And it can be a contingency service. If you need to make a payment that you should have made using the traditional batch system, you can make it in real time and the money arrives when it should. All of these use cases are useful. They're all used in the UK, the high volume of them. But it's not really, when you think about the innovation that we're seeing in the payment space that's being driven by the new entrants, by the Alipays, by the Googles, by the Apple Pays, it's not really yet in that space. I'll skip that one. Government sector, another interesting area for real time. So emergency benefits payments, paying people's unemployment benefit, paying their pensions. A lot of that is paid traditionally using the batch system. But if a pension run is delayed by a day or two because there's been some sort of issue, that tends to be front page news that the pensioners didn't get paid today when they were expecting it. And actually faster payments can be used as a safety net. So if for some reason the government is late with a payment run, we have an ability to convert it into a real-time payment. Innovation in the UK sort of began when we launched the PayM service. And there are definitely some lessons to be learned from that. PayM service was designed initially to allow P2P payments. So I could pay anybody using just their mobile number, and they would receive the funds in real time. Again, a useful service, but really where it comes into its own, we think, is P2B, where I can pay the electrician or the plumber without knowing their bank details, just knowing their mobile number or their email address. And this is the space where people are really moving the capability forward. So if you look at Singapore, they are also in the process of launching this service, and they will have multiple proxies, not just mobile number. There'll be mobile number, email address, possibly biller ID, and so on. In Thailand, they're basing a whole national instant payment service around a proxy capability where you could have your national ID, so anybody can be paid just using their national ID. Anybody can make payments just using their national ID. Anybody can make a payment to a biller ID without knowing the bank information. Anybody can make a payment using an email address. Anybody can go to an ATM and actually move funds in real time using their national ID card. So that's beginning to be real innovation in terms of where you can take the real-time payments platform. So how does it work in the UK and how does it work generally? So we have a central database that stores the proxy information, be it email address, be it mobile, be it biller address. It's maintained and controlled by the participants. So it's secure, and you use existing secure bank channels to create the data, to update the data, and so on. And when I want to make a payment, if I wanted to pay Steve using my mobile, and I've got his mobile number, basically I go into my bank's mobile banking app. I say pay Steve using PayM. I've probably got Steve's mobile number in my phone, so I get the mobile out of the directory. My bank then goes and looks up Steve's account information from the database. It comes back to me and says, is it Steve that you want to pay? So just in case I've got the wrong mobile number. I confirm it is Steve I want to pay, and the money is sent to him in real time. And depending on what his bank has set up or how the scheme's been set up, Steve will probably get an SMS or an email confirming that I've paid the funds to him. That's not a use case that will ever happen in real life. It's highly unlikely I'll be paying Steve. And then pay him for business users. So recently, in the UK, there's been a decision to expand the service to include business users. And I think that's having an immediate impact in terms of growth in volumes and growth in terms of the use cases that are available. The ability to pay someone using a mobile number or a proxy is a component, an element of what we believe to be a truly successful real-time service. But it's not the be-all and end-all. And particularly if you look at what participants need to deliver in order to generate revenues and to delight their corporate customers, the next step is also to take that into the e-commerce space. And PayM is now being enhanced as a capability in the UK by a service called Pay by My Bank. And I think one of the lessons to be learned from the UK is that the e-commerce space is now extremely competitive. And one of the surprising things in the UK is that PayPal now own, I think, 28% of the e-commerce space. So that's an extremely significant volume. It's an extremely significant revenue stream. And it's a whole bunch of customer behaviors that the participants, that the banks no longer see, they no longer have information on. So that's a tremendous loss. But the banks have now realized that this is a space that they need to compete in, and they're launching, actually there were some announcements this week, Pay by My Bank, where using your traditional, your standard mobile banking application, you can pay a merchant online in real time. You can pay a merchant at a point of sale, and you can basically make any payment. Eventually, you'll be able to make any payment transaction using your bank. So it won't be Apple Pay, it won't be PayPal, it won't be Alipay or whatever the local equivalent is. It will be, I'm making this payment via my bank, so it's the bank's brand that appears back in front of the customer. The merchants love Pay by My Bank for a number of reasons. First of all, it actually increases the volume of successful transactions that they have. Being able to accept a payment in real time with just the use of a token that takes no more than 10 seconds and potentially less if you're registered on the website where you're making the transaction, means that the merchants have fewer dropouts. You don't have to key in a load of card data or account data. You don't have to key in your memorable date or password or any of those other things. It reduces fraud because You're not entering any account data, you're not entering any card data, you're simply passing a token. And in the unlikely event that someone manages to get hold of that token, the worst thing they can do is pay for your pizza or pay for your DVD that will be delivered to you anyway. It also enables participants in a real-time service or on the e-commerce service to offer their merchants value-add services, such as verifying the consumer's address. So clearly, delivery of goods to the wrong address or a different address to your actual address is an area of significant fraud. And who is it that knows the customer's address better than anybody else? It's the banks. You've got the customer's address. So providing the customer's address to your merchants is a service that they will almost certainly pay for, because it reduces fraud and makes it a nice, smooth transaction. So you don't even have to key in the delivery address. It's already provided. I guess the other extremely important lesson to be learned from our experience in the UK is the need for ubiquity. And in Canada, you're now looking at your long-term strategy for digitizing, for modernizing the payments landscape. And if there was one thing that I would say is key, it's making sure that your basic services, that your ability to make payments is ubiquitous. Because you'll be successful if everybody can reach everybody, or 90% of accounts. If I can pay Steve, but I can't pay Jim because his bank isn't registered for the service or isn't part of the service, then eventually I will stop using the capability. I'll use it if it's simple, if it's easy, and I can reach everybody. And PayM is certainly growing as a service. I think we now have over 3 million registered customers, but banks have marketed it in different ways. It doesn't really have a brand that consumers are that aware of. Different banks treat it differently, position it differently, and there's a degree of confusion in the market. Whereas if you have a brand that's paid by my bank, everybody understands what it is. I'm making this payment via my bank account. They understand that it's ubiquitous because they're able to make payments everywhere. That's going to be a successful service. Sorry, Steve, I've sort of been talking away here. Is there anything that you want to add on any of those points?
Ubiquity is good. Yes.
Excellent. Excellent. Very good. Well, I think we've reached the end of my slide. Does anybody have any questions? Please. Well, I guess there are a number of factors at play here. Interchange fees are under pressure, certainly in Europe, perhaps less so here, but a lot of these transactions that are going to or will go to the Pay by My Bank service are transactions that would have been made via PayPal, that would have been cash, perhaps would have been cash on delivery, that sort of thing. So yes, there probably is a degree of cannibalization, but not as much as people are concerned about. There are a lot of new volumes that are generated from something like Pay by My Bank. And you'd still get a revenue stream. In fact, potentially you get a bigger revenue stream, because the way it's being set up in the UK is that there is a fee for the transaction. The merchant is happier to pay that fee because they know they're going to get reduced fraud, they're going to get higher volumes of transactions. So it's a new revenue stream as opposed to a cannibalization of a revenue stream in general terms. Yes. Yes, and fraud was a big concern when the service was launched, but actually isn't really about more fraud or easier fraud. It's just the same fraud being done in real time. And the area, the central service is not where the fraud happens. Spoofing an email address, you're going to have trouble doing that because the data is stored in a secure central repository. You only access it via bank channels. So it's more about taking over people's bank accounts. It's more about getting hold of their passwords via social engineering than it is in relation to the real-time payment service or the PayM service. But I think there are definitely things that can be done to help protect participants in the service. And one of the things that we're doing in the UK, we're working on something called Payments Data Insight, which includes fraud detection elements. So by having a single central payment service provider that processes all payments, you've got a central repository of consumer behavior, typical customer transactions. And give you an example. So if, again, hypothetically, I'm going to pay Steve.
Thank you.
Nothing unusual in that transaction. I'm sending $20 to Steve, looks perfectly normal. But the central payments processor can see that in the last 10 minutes, there have been 200 payments to Steve's account. And those 200 payments are not visible to the participants. So it's possible as a central payments processor to warn the banks that we are seeing unusual behavior and to give them an opportunity to catch and stop the fraud. Invoice fraud is another area where having a single central payments processor can be extremely useful. So spoofing an invoice, so sending an invoice to Steve pays his window cleaner on a monthly basis, and I send him an invoice saying, I've changed my bank details, can you pay me to this account number this month? And probably Steve's not going to think that's anything unusual, it happens, but we can tell that something has changed, that there's something not right about this transaction, that in fact, you don't tell Steve the account has changed, you just send him an invoice with a new account number, and Steve's not going to notice, he just pays it. We can tell that all of a sudden this payment to Joe's window cleaners is going to a different account number, and we can highlight that to Steve's bank, and with any luck they'll save Steve some money. So fraud, you're never going to solve it completely. It's not a factor of a central process. It's not a factor of real-time payments or mobile payments. It just means the fraud, when it's going to happen, happens more quickly. But having a central capability actually allows you to detect more fraud than you were able to in the past.
Let me build on this, because when we were looking to design our approach to faster payments in the US, we looked at the experience in various places, and we made a very conscious decision to go with a credit transfer only approach. There are no real-time third-party debits in the system we're building. It does not eliminate the ability to initiate fraudulent payments. It's still, there's the account takeover. However, it radically simplifies the process of identifying those points of vulnerability. You cut off all of those points of vulnerability that are designed to go after you go and get the money from someone else. So just a little bit of simple math. If I want to steal from 100 people's accounts, in a debit system, if I can compromise one account to initiate 100 debits, I can do that. If it's a credit transfer system, I have to compromise all 100 accounts to do it. So simple things like that. So what you find is the places you have to go to harden the system, to detect, it simplifies it, and then you can really train all of your efforts on that. And on things like invoice fraud, we heard of some of the concerns that you mentioned, and when we designed our system, we designed a way that you actually route the invoices themselves through the central system, not unlike what you're doing with the pay by bank, but yep. We've actually built that in from the very beginning into the system so that the central infrastructure could scrutinize it, so that at least it's coming in through a bank-sponsored approach where you can apply more scrutiny. So you're absolutely right, fraud's important, and if money can move more quickly, you need to be careful with that. But by learning from the experience of others, we've hoped to get ahead of that game. Good question.
Yes. And you're talking about the UK experience? Yes. ISO 20022, and again, it's another lesson learned from the UK, and it's probably a little bit unfair to criticize the UK because back in 2008, ISO 20022 wasn't the mature standard that it is today. But I think we engage on a global basis, and there isn't a single country that isn't looking at ISO 20022. It's become the de facto standard. And one of the advantages of ISO 20022, combined with real-time payments, combined with invoicing, is that all of that information that either doesn't get input by somebody or gets miskeyed by somebody actually is digitized. And the sort of one of the use cases that we think is a big winner for both consumer and for the participants is if you can combine a request for payment with an electronic invoice that lands on my mobile and I authorize it, then you're never going to get a misapplied payment. You're never going to get incorrect invoice data. Because one of the things about real-time payments is they happen in real time or they don't happen in real time. So you don't get this, the payment's being received, but we're not too sure what to do with it. We're going to stick it in a suspense account and then we're going to spend a week trying to work out where it belongs. So the combination of ISO 20022, real-time, e-commerce, m-commerce, solves a lot of those problems. In terms of what's being done, there is a lot of work being done in the UK to look at how we can get the participants onto an ISO 20022 standard, but it's not a small undertaking.
Should I
Yeah,
start
please.
talking about what we're doing?
Yep.
So first, yes, we are building a new industrial strength clearing and settlement system for real-time payments in the U.S. One of the questions we get, so is this something being built on, say, ACH or being built on debit card rails? That we are building a new rail. And one of the reasons, quite frankly, is that we have a very good ACH. We have very good debit card systems. And if all we wanted to do was build something, we're already doing that. We're going to same-day ACH in September. So we're already making progress. And because of the fact that we don't have a mandate, there is not government regulatory pressure. There's encouragement. I'll talk about that in a second. But there's no pressure. It would actually take an act of Congress to force the U.S. to go to real-time payments. And I don't know if you are familiar with politics south of the border, but we can't even name post offices. So that's not going to be happening. So we had to do something that went beyond what we can do with what our existing system. So we are building a new rail, and it's built from the ground up to do some of the things we just talked about. It integrates a lot of the messaging, the payments. It's being built natively ISO 20022 from the very beginning. And so, yes, we are building a new payment system. One of the things we also, when we got the go-ahead from our board to do this, they said build a safer, faster payment system. They didn't say a faster, safer system, and that was deliberate. And so there are a lot of the protections that we were just talking about, but not just protections in terms of preventing fraud, but protections in terms of the certainty of the payments, the ability to folks to use them, that type of thing. It will allow consumers and businesses to send and receive payments instantly directly from their accounts at financial institutions. And this was seen as being important because right now, if you want to move money instantly in all of its facets, you're probably going to have to go outside a separate type of an account. A lot of the fintechs, but that's not as convenient as it needs to be. And so the idea here is you can use the current accounts that you already have. And one thing, and this was definitely a lesson learned looking at other countries, rather than build an instant payment system and then later build the overlay, some of the things you've done with PayM, and we decided to build some capabilities into the system, in particular around some of the additional messaging that would make payments to, from, or among businesses easier. So we do have the request for payment message that Kris mentioned. We do have certain types of acknowledgments and payload messages that are a core part of the system, and they are carried through the same system. So the capabilities are there. We're not going to have to build them later. So again, there's one advantage to being, I think what Jerry Getz said this morning was wave 2. An advantage of being in wave 2 is wave 1 does a lot of the learning for you, and you can take advantage of that. The second thing, I'm glad that your last slide was about ubiquity. Ubiquity is going to be a tough thing in the U.S. We have 16,000, we believe, payment active financial institutions. The fact that we don't actually know how many financial institutions we have is, I think, kind of telling, but it's a lot. So we're not going to be able to get to Ubiquity immediately. We can't just go in, sign up a few folks. But what are we doing? First of all, even though the clearinghouse is owned by 24 banks, this is not a system that will only be available to those banks. Our directive was we want this to be something that's not only available but used by every financial institution. We're not just saying you're welcome. What we're doing is actively taking steps to make it easy for any financial institution to be part of the network. So we're working with the third-party processors. We're working with intermediaries such as corporate credit unions, bankers, banks, to really have make it easy, take advantage of existing relationships and connections that they have. One of the other things, and you'll probably hear me say this a few times throughout here, we're trying to get there very quickly. We might be late to the game, but we want to make up for lost time. And so one of the things we did decide to do is, even though we are doing some new things, we're building it. We decided not to build it on our own. We actually, we are using technology from our friends at VocaLink, which is giving us a good head start. And then we're asking you to add lots of other cool stuff to it, which makes it even more fun. But we didn't want to start from the ground up, and so it's a deliberate decision there. I'm going to spend a little bit of time just describing what it is, because that's a question a lot of folks have, is what exactly is it that we are doing? Okay, the usual, 24/7, 365, in immediate. Everybody gets that. That's sort of the core of what a real-time payment system is. These are purely credit push payments. We already talked about how that really does simplify it. But one of the things that kept coming up as we went through every single aspect of it is credit push is just different. If every payment is a credit transfer that starts with a customer telling their financial institution, send money to someone, a lot of the things that you build into other payment systems, you just don't do that, or you have to think of them differently. So we actually, when we were going through our design workshops, we spent about 20 minutes talking about authorization systems before we realized you don't need an authorization system. The money just is already there. You're working with your own customer. And there's about a dozen other things like that that come out of being a pure credit push system. Standard but extensible message formats. We are using the ISO 20022 standard. Not only that, we participated in a group last year that said ISO 20022 allows a certain number of ways of making a credit transfer. We want to agree on a common way that not only in the U.S. but in other countries. By the way, I was going to say CPA, but Payments Canada also participated in this. Voca was participating in this group, a number of players. But we want to make sure we're doing it in the same way. So certain segments, they're mandatory, or we say we are going to use this and we aren't going to use that one, or this many repeats. And the reason is, even though right now this is a domestic system that we're building, we want it to be able to be cross-border in the future. The second thing, though, is it's extensible. And this is one of the advantages. Someone in the back asked about ISO 20022. The fact is that it does allow a great deal of extensibility, especially in the way it uses data. And we think that that's going to be an important platform for using this extensible data to create some really fascinating products and services that we can't even imagine right now. Real-time messaging with bank-grade security, that's what I was referring to earlier. All of the messaging goes through the same secure channels. And so it'll be delivered by a financial institution to their customers through their own trusted connections, their existing connection. What this does is it actually should simplify the move forward in using some of these extended capabilities, the non-payment messages like the request for payment, because we'd be working with existing channels. But there should also be more trust about it. It's not like I just get an invoice over the email saying, now send it to this bank account. It's come from a bank, and so if there are problems, we can take enforcement actions, or the regulators can take enforcement actions against the bank that is not doing a good enough job of KYC. And so it tightens it up a little bit there. Integrated tokenization. Y'all are familiar with things like the way tokenization is being used with mobile card type of payments. You replace the account number with another code that can't be used for anything other than that one purpose. Well, you mentioned tokenization earlier in your pay by bank system. We want to do that with demand deposit accounts as well. And what we don't want to do is do it just for real-time payments. We want this to be something that can be used, in all aspects of the industry. I see Jan Estep and Jane Larimer back there. We would love to work with NACHA to come up with a common approach to tokenization, and we're working on that. And so the idea is that it's not going to be available immediately, but we won't have to worry about sharing account information. And I already mentioned the global compatibility, how we're looking at doing it. But one advantage of that is even while you have a purely domestic system, companies, financial institutions that work in more than one country can do the same approach. And hopefully that'll be beneficial. And they can go to the same technology providers who can build once and sell many. The messages that we are incorporating in addition to we have the basic credit transfer are the requests for payment. This can be used to e-invoice on a business-to-business basis, but it could also be used to deliver a consumer bill. And as one of the big advantages here, as Kris mentioned earlier, was that if you get a request for payment and then that is turned into a payment, the data is going to be right. You don't have to worry about the application of funds. Payment acknowledgement by the receiver. First of all, every payment, every transaction actually is going to be immediately acknowledged. Yes, we received it. And it's acknowledged that it is a successful transfer of that message. You can either, if you get a payment, the financial institution can either accept it, which means it is going into the account immediately. They can reject it, which means, hey, maybe the account wasn't there. There's some reason they can't. But there's nothing saying, hold on a second. This is going to take us a while to figure out. One of the folks in our design team referred to this as the Yoda principle. There is do or not do. There is no try. And so there's more certainty about what's going on. This other, though, payment acknowledgement, once a payment has been received, the receiver can then send additional information. So it's one thing to say, I have paid my cable television bill. But it's another for the cable television company to say, I have received your payment. Oh, and by the way, I received it on time. I'm not cutting your TV off before the Super Bowl or whatever. And so that's an extra level of assurance. But think about this in a business-to-business context. I've received your payment on this invoice, so I'm shipping the goods now. Here's the tracking information. It can be a carrier for lots of other things. The other messages, request for information in response. This is typically used to help resolve exceptions. I received this payment, but the invoice number you gave me is not one that I know. Look again, try harder, that type of thing. And then the remittance advice. Think about this as the big tractor trailer truck of payments remittance information. It can carry much more information, more extensive than one can carry in the simple credit transfer. We think that with these building blocks, you can actually structure transactions that go way beyond just pure payments. We see, payment transaction volume projections. Yes, this is what we're looking at. I wouldn't fall in love with the actual numbers because I'm not actually clairvoyant. We hope we get good take-up, but we will see. The main point we want to get across here is we actually see it spread across a variety of use cases. We didn't want to build this just for one use case. And just an example of what we mean by the more extensive use of information, not unlike the example Kris gave with the paying the plumber or such. Here we're looking at it in more just an example in business to business. The request for payment is going to from the supplier to the buyer. The payment comes through and then they get that confirmation. But what we wanted to point out here is that this can be done. You can do these things right now if all of the folks making the buyers and suppliers are in the same business to business scheme. The fact here is these are independent products that rely on how the messages will be handled by the banker for the large supplier and the small business as the buyer. They do it separately, but they work as planned because there's a standard for how you apply the payments. Quickly, we want to save time for questions. You probably have heard about the Federal Reserve Faster Payments Task Force, actually a number of my fellow task force members I see here in the audience. And the question is, so how does that work? Does the Fed have to pick you in order for you to build this payment system? Well, first, we are actively building the payment system. I talk to Kris's folks all the time, and so we're moving forward with it. The Fed did not say, we're going to figure it out and then we'll tell you what to do. Again, there's no mandate in the U.S. The Fed, what they're doing is a fantastic thing. They're catalyzing the entire industry, and by that I'm not talking about just financial institutions. The users of the system, representatives of consumers, of businesses, governmental agencies, regulators, a lot of folks involved, all trying to figure out what we as a country want to do. This task force established 36 criteria, which, by the way, our team who actually filled this out says no, it's 104 criteria because there are sub-criteria about the ubiquity, the efficiency, the safety, security, the speed of the system. In fact, of the 36 criteria, I think only, 6 is it, are actually fast criteria. The rest are all the other aspects, and I think that's important. We're not just talking about fast payments. We're talking about payments that do so much more. They're safer, they're better in a lot of different ways. And they're asking for proposals. The Fed actually received 22 proposals. Ours was one of them. We've announced that. And I think there's a lot of creativity, but the Fed is not going to go out and pick a proposal. They'll be evaluated. We think you did well here, not well there. We think we did fairly well on all of the criteria. But the Fed's job is not to pick it. I think the best thing the Fed has done here, establishing the criteria, and really getting some enthusiasm, getting some movement in the market. Regardless of what the Fed proposal evaluation comes out with, we are building the system, we are going to market. And finally, what are some of the lessons learned? I'll go through these fairly quickly, but I think they're fairly important, or hope they're important. One, this is a big deal. It's a strategic initiative. And it's not just because of the price tag. It's not because of the effort, but it's because it can change the way payments are done in a country. For us, it required CEO-level commitment from financial institutions. The financial institutions that are represented on our board are represented by their CEOs. We did a study in 2014. It was a nice study. I led the study. It was a beautiful study, nicely bound and everything. Walked in. The CEOs looked at the study, put it aside, says, we don't need to read this. We know what we need to do. My boss said we walked in with an update and we came out with a mandate. But it was, you're going to do this. And that level of CEO commitment is actually why we were able to move forward as quickly. And that's why we had to move forward quickly, because patience levels weren't really that high. A new payment network gives you a way of rethinking your traditional notions of payments without legacy constraints. And by the way, I'm a big fan of the existing payment systems. Even in the UK, you still have, 4 fax payments for every faster payment. But when you're coming up with something new, you can think about how to build it differently from the ground up. And hopefully we've taken advantage of that in what we're doing. When you don't have a government mandate, and we did not have a government mandate, you really start thinking about how can I make this useful enough that people will want to use it, that people will want to implement it. And that's why we built some of this additional functionality that goes well beyond the payments themselves. The non-payment transactions, they're the building blocks for value-added products. You notice I didn't say use cases, I said products. Because quite frankly, until somebody goes out and sells a product, nothing's going to happen. Folks don't just say, I want to make a payment. Someone has convinced them, I got a product that's going to be great for you. So I'm a big fan of just the pure naked commerce aspect of how you're going to get folks to use it. It takes a while to really figure out how differently this is and how it can support innovative financial services. A lot of the talk we have with folks who are going to be using this, they say, okay, I use a wire now and now I use this. Or I do this with ACH now and now I'm doing this. And it's kind of like, no. I mean, if that was what you want to do, we would just use those and maybe use them better. The fact is, where the value comes is if you rethink end-to-end how commercial transactions work. Think about things that don't exist now. The final one is, I think it's important to avoid analysis paralysis. We've felt a sense of urgency on this, largely because the folks who tell us what to do told us to feel a sense of urgency. So we've been moving quickly. We could have analyzed and analyzed and analyzed, but we didn't because we did not have the time to do it. But that has helped. And when you get that sense of urgency, things just happen. And I think if that was one of the big learnings is get that senior commitment and use it to light a fire under your own feet to get something done. I think it's helped us. Hopefully by next year when we're in the market and actually doing transactions, hopefully all of this will pan out. Again, it's to be seen, but we hope it's really helped us do this well. Any questions? Yes. Sure. Why are banks doing this if it's not required, right? Yes. A whole lot of different perspectives. First of all, I don't think there was any coincidence in the fact that the vote by the CEOs to go ahead and do this came the day after Apple Pay was announced. And the vote to go ahead, start working on contracting with these folks here came when Facebook Messenger was announced. The idea was if we're not bringing advanced financial services to our customer, someone else will. And we need to be the ones who are getting ahead of the game. And so I think that was probably the biggest motivator. I think the other side, we're hearing a lot of interest from the commercial sides of banks that they could actually develop some products to, from, or among businesses that they can actually make some good revenue on.
It's as much, we tend to focus a lot on where can you generate revenue streams, but in many cases it's a defensive play as much as a revenue play, because people are already doing things in this space. You know, the fintech guys, Ripple and all the rest, they will find ways of making these payments and servicing your customers. And if you don't play in this space, somebody else will. And I think we were so pleased actually that the US banks decided to do this without a mandate, because we spend a lot of time evangelizing and saying it's great and it's the best thing since whatever. But actually when the banks themselves realize that they need to do it, you know, that tells you that instant payments have become mainstream.
Yeah. Back in the Good point. We have about a 30-page letter to the Fed describing exactly how we want to do settlement, but I'll give you the short version. We are looking at a completely pre-funded settlement mechanism. Unlike you see in other countries where there is pre-funding of a collateral account and you cast settlement several times a day, we're actually going to be settling instantaneously. Each transaction basically is going against a ledger. And so it is instantly settled based on a pre-funded account. This is actually how we do, the clearinghouse runs a wire transfer system that does it this way. Now, what do you do over the weekend? We've done some extensive modeling, and what we find out is the fact that payments, especially in a credit transfer system, they tend to net out. Where you get the chances where they won't typically happens during the week, during business hours, when there is the opportunity to top up your account. We did learn one thing from the UK where the standing orders that Kris mentioned, there are a lot of banks that would release all of them at 12:01. We are going to have a talk with anybody who does something like that and to avoid that kind of settlement bubble. But it's going to be a completely pre-funded, and that's really about the only way we felt that we could manage with 16,000 entities that don't necessarily all have the ability to scrutinize the credit of each other. Does that answer your question? Okay. Is anyone giving us the hook? We're a couple minutes over.
Just the last thing to mention, there's a lot of things that Steve hasn't talked about in terms of things they're doing. One of the things to think about is that real-time payments reduce your back office costs, both for your corporate customers and for participants. But real-time payments are irrevocable. So God forbid, should I ever actually make a payment to Steve, then at least my bank can make a request for information
yeah.
or a request for a refund. Whereas in the UK, payments are irrevocable, and I would have to fill out Form 57B in triplicate, and that paper would flow through the system, and there would be a bunch of people that dealt with it. Whereas I think some of the clever things
I'm
that
glad
you're
you
doing.
mentioned that. We learned as much as we could. We'll steal any good idea. But actually, the one about the back, because people said, gee, now we're going to have to staff 24/7. I went over to the UK before we started signing checks and such, and I toured the operations. I said, okay, show me your faster payment operation. And they would say, we don't got one. And it's not, I mean, there are obviously people who work on faster payments, but there are no exception queues because it either succeeds or everything is completely automated. So you have folks doing setup. You have folks doing a little bit of after-the-fact customer service kind of stuff, but there's no buttons to be pushed. It either happens or it doesn't. And that was one of the biggest findings for us, was fascinating, actually. Okay, anything else? Thank you.
Thank you very much.